Hi, welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy and specifically the severe slowdown that we're now seeing in GDP. Because the figures for January GDP show a 2.1% fall year on year, which is the first fall that's been officially recorded since March 2023, which is almost 3 years ago. Now on its own, 1 month doesn't represent a trend. But when you look at what's happening across the wider Russian economy with things like retail sales, industrial production, manufacturing activity, rail freight, consumer confidence and regional budgets, the evidence increasingly suggests that the Russian economy is swiftly losing momentum. And that's significant because over the last couple of years, the narrative coming out of Moscow has been that the Russian economy has adapted to sanctions, that the wartime economy, which has been the way that it's focused, is working, and that defence spending has more than compensated for the loss of Western trade, technology and investment. But what we're seeing now is that the wartime growth model appears to be running out of steam. Russia's economy grew strongly in 2023 and 2024, with growth above 4% in both of those years, largely driven by massive government spending on defence and military production. But that momentum has slowed sharply. GDP growth for 2025 came in at 1%, and forecasts for 2026 range between 0.5 and 1%, depending on which institution you're listening to. So the trajectory here is clearly downward. And one of the first places that we're now seeing that slowdown show up is consumer spending. Retail sales growth in January slowed to just 0.7% year on year, which is the weakest performance since the start of 2023. In December, retail sales were growing by almost 4%, so that's a very sharp slowdown in a very short period of time. And that matters because consumer spending is one of the largest components of Russia's economy. If households start tightening their belts, that quickly feeds through into weaker activity across retail, services, hospitality and manufacturing. And there are several reasons why consumers are becoming more cautious. One of the biggest is the cost of borrowing. Russia's central bank pushed interest rates extremely high to combat rising inflation. And even though rates have been cut significantly recently, borrowing costs are still running at historical high levels. They're currently sitting above 15%. And that means consumers are less willing to take out loans for big purchases like cars, home improvements, holidays or major appliances, and the same is true for businesses. High borrowing costs discourage companies from investing, expanding or taking on additional debt. Businesses that are struggling with cash flow are also finding that refinancing existing debt is becoming increasingly expensive. So the overall result is that both consumers and businesses are becoming more cautious, and that caution is starting to slow the wider economy. And before we go on any further today, I'd like to talk to you about today's sponsor, Claude Note Pro, the world's most advanced AI note taker. Now this is the device itself, which is uber stylish, super thin and really light, and also a very high quality piece of kit. It's really nicely designed, feels great in the hand, and you can tell immediately that this is a premium product. And this device is essentially a small AI recording assistant. You can use it to record meetings, conversations, interviews, phone calls, or even just your own ideas when they come to mind. And the really clever part is that the AI automatically transcribes and summarizes everything for you. So instead of having to sit there taking notes or trying to remember everything that was said, Claude Note Pro creates a structured set of notes and key points that you can refer back to later. It also gives you access to its own artificial intelligence assistant, Ask Claude, which means you can interact with your notes, ask questions and quickly pull out the information that you need. That can be incredibly useful if you're in meetings, doing interviews, recording podcasts, or just trying to organize your thoughts during the day. So if you're interested in buying one of these amazing pieces of kit that can save you a lot of time and effort, then have a look at the link in the description below. And the great news is that there's a 30-day free return policy on all purchases made through my link. So you can give it a try out completely risk-free. So coming back to the Russian economy, the slowdown is not just visible in consumer spending. we're also now seeing signs of weakness in industrial production. Industrial production in January fell by around 0.8% year on year, which is a sharp change from the growth we were seeing just a few months ago. Manufacturing surveys are also showing contraction, with Russia's manufacturing PMI coming in below the 50 mark, which indicates that activity is shrinking rather than expanding. And another indicator that economists often look to is rail freight volumes, because rail freight is a very good proxy for what's happening in the real economy. Things like coal, metals, oil, products, construction materials, and industrial goods, and those numbers are also pointing to a slowdown. Rail freight volumes have fallen significantly compared with previous years, suggesting that heavy industry and commodity flows are weakening. Now, one of the reasons why the Russian economy was able to grow strongly in 2023 and 2024 was because of the massive increase in defense spending. The government pumped huge amounts of money into weapons production, military equipment, ammunition factories, and defense contractors. That spending created jobs, boosted industrial output, and supported GDP growth. But the problem with that model is that it's not sustainable growth strategy. Defense production doesn't necessarily create long-term productive capacity in the same way that investment in technology infrastructure or consumer industries do. And there are also signs that even the defense sector may now be facing capacity constraints and financial pressures. Sanctions have restricted access to certain technologies and industrial components. Borrowing costs remain high, and some reports suggest that payment delays and regulated pricing in the defense sector are starting to create financial stress for manufacturing. So the sector that has been driving Russia's growth may itself now be losing momentum. And at the same time, the wider Russian economy is facing a number of structural pressures. Sanctions continue to limit access to Western technology and finance. Trade flows have become more complicated and expensive. Oil exports often have to be sold at massive discounts, and Russia is increasingly reliant on a small group of trading partners. Now, none of this necessarily causes an immediate economic collapse. Sanctions often work much more gradually than that. What they tend to do is raise costs, reduce efficiency, and weaken productivity over time. And when you combine that with high interest rates, slowing consumer spending, and weaker industrial output, the result is exactly what we're now seeing: a broad slowdown in economic activity. So the key takeaway from all of this is that the Russian economy hasn't collapsed, but it is clearly losing momentum. The wartime spending surge that drove growth in 2023 and 2024 is no longer providing the same boost. Consumer spending is slowing, industrial production is weakening, and the longer the war continues, the greater the economic strain is likely to become. Because war is extremely expensive, and sustaining a wartime economy over many years places enormous pressure on government finances, businesses, and households. So this slowdown is a strong indication that 2026 is going to be a very difficult year for the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, found it useful, informative, and most importantly, thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Don't forget, I'm currently running my competition where you can win my property or a cash alternative prize. Scan the QR code on the screen now or click the link in the description below if you're interested in getting involved with that. Thank you so much to everyone that's supported me in other ways. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks or signed up as a patron or a member, thank you for that support. Really helps to keep me motivated. And here's something to put a smile on your face.